Hi, my name is Mark Turnbull, aka 1642 author. Please like and subscribe to this channel. Here you'll find videos all about the 17th century Wars of the Three Kingdoms, which has fascinated me since the age of 10. My aim is to make this often overlooked history more accessible to all. So thanks for tuning into this mini documentary that explores the life of parliamentarian Sir William Brereton. I'm going to be speaking to David Morgan, a former Croydon headteacher, now the volunteer education officer at Croydon Minster, about the intriguing mystery of Brereton's coffin-clad corpse. So without further ado, welcome David. Thanks for joining me to talk about the mystery of Brereton's body.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So tell us, first of all, how did your interest in William Brereton begin?
Well, my interest in William Brereton began when I was looking back through the history of the Archbishops Palace in Croydon. Much of my history research is centered around the church, which now is a minster, but back then was a parish church. And right beside where the parish church is the old palace, which belonged to the Archbishops of Canterbury. We had 6 Archbishops of Canterbury buried in Croydon Minster. But in looking through the history of the palace, of course, I came across the time when there were no archbishops there, and was interested to see what had happened at that point, and then discovered that William Brereton had been given the palace to at least not necessarily live in permanently, but live in for a time. And so I began to look to see how interesting a character he was, to be able to stay and live in the palace, which really belonged to the Archbishops of Canterbury.
And it sounds like you struck gold in terms of how interesting a character he was, which we'll come to in a moment. So 6 archbishops buried there. When was the last one?
That's Archbishop Herring. So we're into the 18th century.
Okay.
They lived at Croydon until they sold up and moved not very far away to Addington, which is like a village outside Croydon, and they bought up the palace that exists there. So they only moved, say, 7 or 8 miles. But it was it's much more of a stately home and a lovely place to be than the old palace, which was really an old manor house with bits added on. So it was never really a palace in the word that you think of. It was a sort of stately home done up a bit.
Well, we're going to talk about this extraordinary tale about the loss of Brereton's coffin-clad body. But first, we'll tease listeners a little bit longer. Let's talk about the man's life and set the scene. So what can you tell us about William Brereton's early years?
Well, he was born in Handforth in Cheshire, in a family that had money, had land, and therefore presumably he was always brought up to do well, whatever that means. I don't know. I haven't found out about his early sort of schooling and things, but he went off to Oxford, to Brasenose College in 1621, but he never graduated, interestingly, from there. So something either went amiss, or he decided not to do it, or he wasn't capable of doing it, because the next sort of reference point really in his life was that he joined Gray's Inn in London in 1624. A year after that, he tried to become an MP, but he failed. He didn't get elected. He became a baronet in 1627, and in 1628 he became an MP for Cheshire. So it's a little bit skimpy, I know, that knowledge of what he was doing, but of course he was born with a privilege, if you like. And it's interesting that privilege took him towards Puritanism, because not everybody in his family went in the same direction that he did.
Yeah, it's interesting that he didn't finish Oxford, isn't it? It's almost like
Yeah.
perhaps that was a turning point for him, and he.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there seem to be lots of turning points. I mean, when you look at his life as a whole, the most successful time that he had was when he was a military commander for the Roundhead forces. He seemed to have thrived on doing that, and seemed to be much more successful at doing that than he was at doing some other things in his life. As in the 1630s, he travelled to Ireland, and he wrote this up as a diary, which you can find online. And he seemed, he was interested, seemed to be genuinely interested, as a baronet would be, going to Ireland, making a comment about what the land might be worth, looking at some of the little towns and villages, and commenting on usually how poor the people were. But also commenting on the fact that, there was a good Englishman there who would, get the money from the crops, or there was a particular family over there who he knew the background of. So,
Right.
he did seem well versed and comfortable with going and travelling through Ireland, and those diaries are well worth a read.
That's interesting. That then, yeah. So do you think it was more a bit of a fact-finding sort of tour for him? More pleasure rather than, or pleasure and business? But
Yeah, I think it was a bit of both. Yes, I think genuinely it was pleasure, but it did give him the opportunity to find out about life, which was different to his. I think he did also do some travels in the Low Country. He went to Holland and looked around there. So he did gain an experience that he could bring back, and then he could fall back on, because he did seem to be able to have a knack when the Civil War started, and he was put in charge of people, that he seemed to be able to motivate them, to understand them. And maybe that's where he got some of that from looking at people in different places in different circumstances.
yeah, and certainly not by avoiding Ireland, because I think a lot of people probably wouldn't have picked Ireland to sort of go to, would there, as such? I mean,
No,
unless they're
I
going
think you're
there
right
for
with that.
fighting. And you mentioned his Civil War career there. Then can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. He I'm not going to start right at the very beginning, because I'm a church historian based in Croydon. I don't know whether anybody's ever been to Farndon Church, St Chad's. Now, in 1643, the parliamentarian army was holed up in that church, in one of their conflicts with the royalists. But today there is the most fantastic stained glass window, where you can see how the Roundheads are dressed. You can see the sort of uniform that they have. You can see some of the weapons that they carry. You can see some of the sort of piles of gunpowder that they would have stored inside that church. So, looking at sort of evidence and seeing what there is for this man and what he was able to do, 1643, when he was in St Chad's in Farndon, is a sort of a really good place to start. 1643 is the key year for him, really, because he was put in charge of, first of all, smaller groups of the Roundheads, but then eventually he was to get a command which included the cavalry. I mean, in March in 1643, he was part of the Battle of Middlewich, which where they defeated the Royalists, and he helped to establish their headquarters at Nantwich. The Royalists were then sort of trying to strengthen their forces, and then in the Second Battle of Middlewich in December 1643, that's when he suffered his only defeat. But one defeat doesn't lose you the war. And so because the Royalists couldn't press home the advantage that they'd got from that particular skirmish, they, in January 1644, the Royalists under Lord Byron, they were routed by Sir Thomas Fairfax and Brereton at the Battle of Nantwich. So, he was there in the thick of the action in the sort of, northwest Cheshire area. And he was commanding forces which were part of the siege of Chester, which is a little bit later in 44, going right through to 46. So off and on, he was part of that great siege. Apparently, there's a story that he also lay siege to Brereton Hall, which was the home of one of his royalist relatives, because the son of the royalist who owned Brereton Hall is supposed to have scratched on a window or something, "On yonder hill my uncle stands, but he will not come near, for he is a Roundhead and I am a Cavalier." So even within his family, there was a bit of strife. Some people were on, but then of course that's the nature of a civil war, isn't it?
Yeah.
Some people were on one side and one was on the other. And then in March 1646, the Battle of the Stow-on-the-Wold, which was where the Royalists surrendered. That was their last sort of surrender on the field of battle on English soil to a Roundhead army. And it was Brereton commanding the Roundhead cavalry who made the difference to the day and provided the parliamentarians with that win. So focusing very much, around the Cheshire area, he was, the enforcer, the commander who went up through the ranks and became a very important part of the parliamentarian cause.
And just getting back to that stained glass window in St. Chad's, stunning window, and photographs just don't do it justice to the, you've got to see it.
Yeah, you need to see it, and you need to be lucky enough to see it on a lovely sunny day when the light is really bright.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
what the time that I went, I don't think there was sunshine, but yeah, even so, it is a fantastic window.
Yeah.
And obviously, so his stomping ground in Cheshire and being an MP there, and that inscription in the window, the nephew inscribing that, just another sign, like you say, of this chasm that it sent through families, this civil war.
Yeah.
So he lived at Croydon Palace. How did he come about to get that?
Well, exactly I can't answer that question directly. It says in various things that I've read that he was given it in 1652. I'm not certain of how those things were divvied up, but maybe he felt, I don't know, he thought he should have a reward, I suppose, for all the things that he did in the field. But it seems strange that was his reward down in London. Well, I know that he had been an MP, was an MP, but why Croydon? Why the Archbishop of Canterbury's palace? Because that was such a prestigious place. We're talking about the place, the palace where, the Tudor Archbishops of Canterbury, people like John Whitgift, Archbishop Grindal, had made a big thing of it. Henry VIII would play at Croydon in the Archbishop's Palace, when he was a lad. When Catherine of Aragon was coming to London to marry Arthur, she stayed at Croydon Palace, at the Archbishop's Palace. The importance of the place can't be underestimated. Sort of one day, the reason why the archbishops bought the palace, or they bought the manor house and developed it into a palace, is because that it's one day's journey horseback south from Lambeth Palace, and then you can stay there overnight and then head east towards Canterbury on the South Downs Way. So a really important place. And so whoever Cromwell wanted to put in there, had to be a significant figure. And yet, in the end, it turns out that perhaps he wasn't so significant as perhaps we might have thought.
And did he have other properties?
He accumulated properties all over the place. In his will, he left. He had this was his only southern portion of land or place. In his will, it mentions that he had lands and houses at Ashton-super-Mersey in Chester, in Eton, it says alias Yayton in Congleton, obviously his own place at Hanforth. He had land in the Forest of Macclesfield, and then there are several other manors in or near Nantwich. There is one mention in his will of land near to Croydon in Norbury. So there was a little something there, but that's very small.
Right.
So yeah, he seemed to accumulate lands very easily. And then his detailed will, which is digitized and you can find in the National Archive, clearly lays out, this to the daughters and what have you. So he was very conscious of, passing on his landed legacy to his children and family. He married twice in his life. His first wife died, and he did have a son and heir, William. I always think that people should be more imaginative about naming their eldest sons.
It's like Prince Rupert and his daughter Ruperta.
Yes. So yeah, and then he had, I think, 2 girls with his second wife, but he made sure that they all got something.
So do we know how he died? Mentioned in his will there.
Well, just before he died, because he died in 1661. So the Restoration, which was the previous year in 1660, Archbishop Juxon was reinstated as the Archbishop of Canterbury, but according to one source, although the palace was returned to him, he allowed Brereton to stay on as a tenant.
Oh, wow.
I think that seems particularly strange to me, but there is one source which does state that as a fact. There are other little bits and pieces about what Brereton did in the Archbishop's Palace.
I presume he sort of took care of it then, if Juxon was willing to let him remain.
Well, this is the thing, you see, because there is a pamphlet which says that he didn't have that much respect. Admittedly, the pamphlet was written by royalists, but it said that he turned he was always fond of his food, apparently, Brereton, and he turned one of the Archbishop's chapels into a kitchen. Well, if he did turn it into a kitchen, it got turned back again. But again, you can find that as a piece of writing. And then also in a pamphlet that was written after his death, it says that he had a prodigious stomach because he liked his fine dining. I don't know whether he liked the fine wine as well as a good Puritan, but I think even Puritans probably had something to drink. But whether or not maybe he enjoyed that side of life a little more than he should have done. But the fascinating thing is that he didn't leave the property straight away, and as a tenant, he died in it.
I love that phrase. What was it? Prodigious appetite, was it?
Yeah, he had a prodigious stomach.
Prodigious stomach. Yeah, that's great, isn't it?
Yeah, he was. I think the whole quote is, he was a notable man at a Thanksgiving dinner, having terrible long teeth and a prodigious stomach.
That's quite an epitaph, then.
Yeah.
So that took us up nicely to his passing. So what about this extraordinary final journey then after his death?
Right. So he dies on the 7th of April, 1661, and the story has it from the Cheshire side of the family is that his body was going to be taken to Cheshire to his country seat and to be buried at the chapel in Cheadle, where other members of his family were buried. The story goes that en route, the coffin was lost, and I quote, in a flood, unquote, and the coffin was swept away. Now, there's no proof that that happens, but that was the story that got written down, certainly in Victorian history books. Now, what on earth was happening? You see, that there are some people who say that he's buried in Croydon, but there is no mention of him in the Croydon burial list. And he certainly isn't buried at Cheadle in the chapel where other members of his family were buried. So one assumes that he has to be between the two.
And Cheadle would be the more likely, I guess, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Now, one of the things in his will, which I find quite interesting, is that there was no mention of "I wish to be buried in," or "if I die, I should be buried within, I don't know, a few miles," or something. Because often in those sorts of wills, there would be an indication of where they want to be buried. Now, it doesn't say in the will where he wants to be buried. There is nothing in the will which says, "I want a Christian burial." There's nothing in the will about, remission of sins, about committing my soul into the hands of the Almighty. All of that sort of phrasing, which is quite common, even amongst Puritans. There was nothing in his will. His will is just cutting up the dividends for his children, family, and friends, but nothing to do with his soul and where he sees his final journey, if you like, not even an earthly journey, but a heavenly journey.
You're right. I think it is quite unusual not to have any sort of religious reference, even because Puritans.
It does start "in the name of God, amen," right at the top. There's just that little phrase, like they all do. But then, you see, you would think that there would be something else, because again, in his will, he leaves 5 books on theology to his brother, who is a clergyman, presumably a Puritan clergyman, although that isn't made clear. He just says that theology books from his study in Croydon, because there's nothing else about him and his faith. Now, I would pose the question: did something? Did all that fighting in the Civil War, did that affect him so that he thought, well, he lost his faith because of it? He saw too many gruesome things. It does happen to people, because in those early days, he is described as as a zealous Puritan, um,
Yeah.
really anti the Church of England, as they were in all their practices, but equally, wanting something plain and simple. But God was there, and was his motive, and his raison d'etre and everything else. Yeah.
Unusual.
And even if you said, I wish, if I die, because I mean, presumably he must have spent in his latter time a little bit of time in Croydon, maybe a little bit of time in his family home in Cheshire.
Mhm.
And again, some people might say, well, if I die in Cheshire, I wish to be buried in the family tomb. If I died in Croydon, I would be buried in the parish church.
Yeah.
And there are some, there are lots of people, because back in those days there was no Southwark Cathedral, so Croydon Parish Church was a really important place for people to be buried, to be seen to be buried.
Right.
And you could be buried with or in the same place as Archbishops of Canterbury. So if people were going to choose to be buried, then a lot of people chose to be buried at Croydon. He didn't make any mention of it, so if the stories are to be believed, they set off with his coffin to Cheshire, but never got there.
So just go back to the coffin then, and this flood. Do you think? I mean, was it sort of washed away into a river or something?
If you're going to cross a stream with a coffin on the back of a cart, you're not going to have a great agile horse. You're going to have a strong horse, aren't you? And you think, well, you're going to what? You're going to a ford, or you try and cross a river with a current that you think is stronger. I mean, it seems difficult.
It's
It
like a
seems
scene from some like Allo Allo, isn't it? Coffins
no.
floating up
You
down
can
stream.
imagine the steward or whoever it is whose job it was to do the transporting. How are you going to go and tell his son or tell the other members of his family that his coffin was washed
Yeah,
away?
it wouldn't be too taxing to sort of to be able to find it, would it? Because you would just follow the stream of, if it
Yeah,
shot off
yeah.
quite
You wouldn't
fast.
just unless there was a big flood and a torrent, it wouldn't go bobbing along, would it? I don't think.
Exactly. Mind you, the prodigious stomach might have helped it, might that might have
Yeah,
kept him
but of course
afloat. They
you see,
did, but
it's such a fanciful story that you
yeah.
think, gosh, how could that have happened to somebody who was so important?
But that sprung from somewhere, hasn't it?
Yeah,
There's
yeah,
clearly a mystery over where his final resting place ended up, and so it seems to have sprung from that. Even if it's a fanciful story,
yeah.
somebody's put it there because nobody knows where he is. Does it just stem back to a Victorian book, or is it sort of relating to sort of family papers or some throwaway
I've
remark?
never read it in any family papers.
Right.
Um, there are people who've done work on the Brereton family, and they, yeah, the word of the people who've done the research on that. Again, they revert back to this sort of written text to say, on the way back, his coffin was lost in a flood.
Mm.
So there, as far as there's no other story made up about it. That's the only story that's ever written down.
Yeah.
But sadly, there are no newspaper quotes, and there's no other first-hand record of it going astray. But going astray, it did. There's some funny stories about bodies being lost at Croydon, because you see, one of the reasons why the archbishops liked the palace, the situation for the palace, and also why the church is where it is right beside the River Wandle. which is a tributary of the Thames. And probably just after this period, the in floods and high water from the river, it would wash against the side of the graveyard and wash out bones of people that had already been buried there.
Do you think that perhaps he was buried there and he's been washed? You know, maybe it was too close or something,
I
and
don't know. Well,
freshly
if he
buried.
if you see if he is buried in Croydon, then I've never found his name written down in the records.
Yeah,
And other people who have studied the records as well as me, sort of, well, eminent Victorian historians now who produce lists of the good and the famous who are buried in Croydon, of which there are a lot. His name never ever comes up.
wow,
So, I mean,
what a mystery.
yeah, what a mystery. Unless he was buried on an unmarked grave. But why would his son, who was still alive, want his father to be buried anywhere else other than in their family chapel? I'm sure he
Yeah,
wouldn't want that. And I wouldn't have thought all the other members of his family to whom he left his land and his money, his gold, because you can look on his will and see what a wealthy man he was. They would have surely wanted to pay their respects and say thank you.
yeah, and as you say, you know, he's not insignificant, you know, and he had Croydon Palace because of it must have been some sort of reward or
Yeah.
recognition. And so, just in terms of Cromwell's protectorate, then did he play any role in the protectorate, or did he sort of retire sort of before
Well,
that?
he seems to have retired, or at least stepped back. He didn't attend the trial of Charles I, where you'd think, if he was a prominent Roundhead, he would want to be there, to see the disgrace, to see the beheading.
Yeah,
But it is a recorded historical fact that he wasn't there. It also says, the historical record says, that he didn't attend Parliament much. Well, I know that lots of people didn't in those days, people who were elected. But you see, this is a different side of Brereton from, the zealous Puritan in his youth and the highly motivated commander in the field for the parliamentary army.
yeah.
Something changed in his life, which, well, maybe it's just old age. I don't know. It doesn't say that he suffered wounds or he struggled with injury, which might have explained it. I mean, the only thing that's written down that you could try to interpret is the fact that there was nothing in his will about, a Christian burial and all the sorts of usual things. I mean, did the man lose his faith? Did he lose the certainty of his faith? He certainly didn't end his life as a zealous Puritan. No, he ended it as somebody who was perhaps a little bit bloated, who liked a meal, but kept on collecting lands and plenty of money from the rents thereof.
Fascinating. I mean,
Yeah, we can't solve the mystery on this little interview.
yeah, SOS to listeners. So, can you shed any light on where William Brereton's body might be? If you heard anything, or if you're a historical fiction writer, there's an ideal mystery that you can use as
Yeah,
a plot.
yeah.
Well, this is something that we definitely need solving, doesn't it? Sometime, but I mean, at the end as well, what a tragedy for the guy, you know, William
Yeah,
Brereton. That life, and you know, and his
yeah,
what he's done and achieved to
yeah.
end in this way, it is very sad. Thanks, David. I mean, that has been really fascinating. And I'd say I knew nothing at all about this story until stumbling across the article that you'd written. So thanks for sharing some more details.
No, it's a pleasure. Well, he is a fascinating man, and I shall look forward to hearing if anybody can come up with any hard evidence of what did happen to him.
Yeah, and keep us posted if you hear anything. And
I certainly will.
yeah, I'll send anything if any listeners get in touch. Yeah.
Lots of his parliamentary papers, that are kept in archives, and maybe there's another few hours worth of work going through some of those.
David, that has been fascinating. Thanks very much for joining me. I hope you've all enjoyed this 1642 author video. Please like and subscribe and watch out for more content. You can follow me on Twitter at 1642author, and you can find out more about my podcast, Cavaliercast: The Civil War in Words, my blog, and my books at 1642author.com.